Okay, thanks so much for that introduction. Happy to be with everyone here today. My name is Jay Johnson, and I've been working as a psychologist in Calgary at least since maybe 2020, maybe 2019. And that's been both in a provisional sense as well as a fully registered sense more recently. I've worked here with the Family Psychology Place since 2021, and it's been really valuable for me to work with quite a few different populations, but a lot of my work is with youth with ADHD, and that is extended to working with a lot of the adults that support them. So sometimes this is teachers. We might work with them through consultation at the school and applying certain strategies there. And a lot of it is with parents, recognizing there's a lot you can do individually with a client one-on-one with the child or youth themselves, but being able to work with parents provides a lot of utility to the other hours of the day, the other days of the week, where they are working to support those kids through some challenges that come with this diagnosis. So I wanted to move on to the slides in a little minute here, but I just wanted to recognize that there will be some times throughout the presentation where I'll pause and ask for questions, and we'll get to as many of those as we can, as mentioned. And I also want to leave some time at the end for any general questions or bits of sharing to fill that rest of that time at the end. So keep in mind, if we don't get to it in that moment, we're hoping to get to those at the end if we can, and also allow some time for some new questions later on. Okay, so the objectives for today, first off, is to, well, I do want to acknowledge first off that participants in today's session, or today's talk, likely range in their experience with ADHD and with the ADHD population. The aim is going to be to balance information that's relevant to most cases of ADHD, as well as looking more closely at some strategies that I specifically use in my day-to-day work with clients. We also recognize there's a lot of information out there, and it's great that we have that at our fingertips, but it can be overwhelming sometimes. And a lot of times it's helpful for families or individuals to work individually with someone like myself so we can figure out what might work best for this child or this individual. Because a lot of the research, as it's generated, is recommended for what works for most, or in most cases, for most children, this is what seems to work. So hopefully we can get a chance to address some of those questions later on, specific to maybe your child or the child that you work with. All right, so we're going to review what ADHD looks like specifically in Canada. That might deal with its prevalence and how common it's become. We also want to recognize that it impacts more than just the individual with the diagnosis. It also affects those who work with them or those who come in contact with them. Then we'll move on to some existing strategies to support those with ADHD. And then we're going to take an even deeper look at some specific strategies and treatment models for ADHD in terms of how we as adults can make an impact, and ideally the most effective impact on the young people we work with. So keeping in mind that there's likely a range of understanding or a range of exposure to ADHD populations, we're going to start with an overview of some of the common features of ADHD. We've likely come in contact with somebody or have an idea in their minds of what ADHD might present as. But here are a few of the most common features, right? Inattention, impulsivity, hyperactivity. There's also a close link to some of those other co-occurring issues like anxiety especially, but it can lead to things like depression. Commonly, children and youth who are diagnosed with ADHD also have a coexisting learning disability in some way. And so those full psychoeducational assessments that run the whole gamut of information about someone can bring those things to light. We haven't missed too much on it. I outlined the objectives of the presentation, and now we're looking at these common features. Okay, thank you for letting me know. Now we're all caught up. So we were just talking about how executive functioning is a term we oftentimes see associated with ADHD. We hear it a lot, but what does it actually mean? Well, it has to do with the brain's management system, is one way of putting it. With ADHD, that's impaired, sometimes somewhat, sometimes quite a bit. And that can mean poor persistence towards certain goals or tasks. as well as things happening in the future. We could describe ADHD as being very present focused. That's oftentimes where impulsivity plays into it. What matters right now in this moment matters more than anything else. And so it's very, very motivating and sometimes overwhelming in terms of focus on the present. This also means that attention can't be sustained over future focused or towards future focused tasks. Distractibility is a common feature too. Now, this would mean an impairment of filtering out what information is relevant to our situation and what information isn't. So it's not so much an inability to focus on things. It might just be an inability or a struggle to sort through what is supposed to be focused on and what is not supposed to be focused on. There's going to be struggles and some deficits in task re-engagement, which is what we'll oftentimes see or suspect with an individual skipping across various tasks rather haphazardly, leaving a lot of them incomplete, where there may be a lot of effort put into a lot of different things, but not necessarily completion of each of those tasks along the way. There's going to be impairment on working memory. And so this involves forgetfulness in daily activities, not being able to handle more than maybe 2 bits of information at a time, but maybe remembering the first task on a list, but not the second and third sometimes. Also, it really will impact showing up in a situation and trying to remember what we were here to do. You know, what am I after here? What am I looking for? What was I asked to retrieve? Whatever it might be. There's going to be some diminished self-monitoring. So that's maybe just another way of saying struggles in awareness, where we might be doing something maybe impulsively or reactively and not fully aware in the moment that we're doing that. There's going to be this flight of ideas or racing thoughts sometimes where the brain is moving so fast and it's hard to keep up with being aware of that in the moment. We'll get into that in a bit more detail when we talk about some strategies to respond to that or to help assist slowing down the rate of what's happening so that the brain with ADHD can keep up in its level of self-monitoring or awareness. Impulsivity and risk-taking is a very common feature of ADHD. It's oftentimes associated with higher rates of getting into trouble, you could call it, but even later on in life, if it's undiagnosed and untreated, it can lead to a lot more criminal activity even. So just something to keep in mind where that risk-taking activity can escalate to other things if we aren't aware of it and if we aren't there as a community to help treat it. Time blindness, we might all experience time blindness at times, so we understand what that looks like. But that pattern of being late for things or not being aware that, oh, there's only 5 minutes left till we have to leave is common with ADHD. And we want to recognize in all of this that ADHD is a deficit in regulation. So sometimes we'll just think of it as struggles with focusing or struggles with controlling our impulses, but it's regulating between those things that is a real challenge. So we'll find that, someone with ADHD can focus really, really well on something that's a preferred activity or something they're passionate about. But regulating their focus away from that to something else is going to be quite the challenge. Also, regulating their attention consistently back to the task at hand that might not be exciting or the person might not be passionate about, that's going to be really tough too. Okay, so I wanted to take a moment to talk about the increased awareness of ADHD as a whole, whether that's just through society or otherwise. More people definitely understand ADHD now than they used to. There's a lot more resources and clinics available for diagnosis and treatment. General practitioners and other family doctors and what have you are a lot more aware of it. It's on their radar. They might even initiate a lot more screening for it than they may have in the past. But there's also a factor of social media's influence. There's a lot of information available for it, and this widespread social media conversation around ADHD might lead to some misconceptions around, I guess everyone might have ADHD, or maybe I have ADHD. Maybe all of us could have it, right? It seems like it's really, really common. But we also recognize it's starting to be used a lot more casually, right? People might describe like, oh, Um, I'm I'm really, really ADHD when it comes to this. We've heard this used in day-to-day, more casual speech around something like OCD. Sometimes people will say, "Oh, sorry, I'm just really OCD when it comes to how I hang pictures in my house or in my office." It doesn't necessarily attribute to an actual diagnosis, but it has been just used more commonly in day-to-day conversation. Um, Modern society might require more of the executive functioning deficits of ADHD as things get a lot more fast-paced and multitasking is almost just an expectation of everyone at all times. And so maybe some of those symptoms are more noticeable in people. And overall, there is an increased level of diagnosis of ADHD. So there's a lot more prescription of the medications that treat ADHD. And so all of this is going to contribute to the perception that the condition is becoming more common. So regardless of the reasons or why, the objective truth is that the rates of ADHD are high and it continues to become more prevalent. So how prevalent is it becoming? We know that, at least here in Canada, ADHD is rising in its prevalence in youth, with national prevalence ranging from 2.6 to 8.6%. That's quite a large presentation when it comes to the national average. Some of us who might work in certain schools or maybe certain sports teams, we might see a higher rate than this in the pool that we work with. But national average, this is what the statistics tell us. We're naturally going to see it more commonly diagnosed in age range of 4 to 17 years old. It's viewed to be more frequent in males and females, especially in younger ages, but we know that this gap will widen as they get older. A lot of the view on this has to do with the convenience or inconvenience level of the behaviors seen in classrooms. Maybe more recently, it's not as much the case, but traditionally, um, girls in school might have been a lot more aware of their behavior, maybe because they mature a little bit quicker, reach puberty earlier than boys. But maybe it was just the fact that these behaviors weren't as obvious to teachers or the adults working with them. So they weren't necessarily referred as frequently as the male students. But as we reach adulthood, the difference in frequency between boys and girls close to disappears. We do know that ADHD is quite heritable, meaning that if one child has, a child will have up to 24% chance if one of their parents has the diagnosis, and if both, that rises to 33%. It should be also understood that if your child has been diagnosed with ADHD, there's roughly a 25% chance that one of their parents has ADHD. So we might be looking at this today or over the course of the presentation and start to ask those questions. Does this describe something I deal with? Maybe that's the case. And the uptick of diagnosis also leads to an increase in the rate of ADHD medication being prescribed. So it has become a lot more regular, a lot more seen in the day-to-day population. So how does this increase in ADHD prevalence, as well as the increase of children that we work with the diagnosis, how does it impact the adults? And we're here with that being our demographic here today. So let's talk about how this impacts us as adults. So we know it increases stress for parents, for sure. Statistics will tell us that up to 80% report clinically significant levels of I guess I didn't include the follow-up there, levels of anxiety or other types of mood disorders, sometimes depression, and they are much more vulnerable to this as well. Naturally, there's going to be higher risks of exhaustion and burnout. It is really challenging to match the energy of kids in general, but especially kids with ADHD. So it will take a toll on us over time. This higher rate of anxiety and struggle with controlling our emotions often also leads to more reactive responses in how we work with these children or these youth. And as that happens and more frequently, and our disciplinary measures get a lot more uh, impulsive and reactive, naturally the relationship's going to struggle too. And so many families that I work with, or even just families that we hear about, really struggle with that relationship, whether it's the trust or just the comfort level around those adults. It does get negatively impacted for sure. We know that these relationships are going to be worsened by the severity of the child's ADHD symptoms. There's going to be a range of maybe coping skills that each child's going to have already in place. Some have some in their arsenal that work really well for them already, and some really do not. And so that can be more or less challenging for the adults that work with them, especially when it comes to these impulsive risk-taking behaviors. Listed them as conduct problems that can just be broken down into getting in trouble at school. A lot of adults I work with describe many instances of cringing at the phone call from the school or from daycare or what have you around, oh, here comes a call about my son or daughter's behavior. And it's a really, really anxiety provoking situation to be in, especially if it happens regularly. We also know that adults with undiagnosed ADHD are going to face the greatest struggle in these situations. They are also going to be more reactive and struggle with their own emotion regulation because there may be some underlying diagnosis that hasn't been addressed. So keeping that in mind, because once we're made aware of that diagnosis, we have a great tool as an adult with ADHD in that we have more empathy to the child in terms of, this is what I went through at this age. And we can learn with them and grow with them and build our skills alongside them. And that's a really valuable thing for parents and teachers alike, as well as any other coaches and adults that work with them. So I want to go through a bit of a rundown of the current evidence-based strategies. So a lot of these are going to come to mind or be used already in classrooms or at home. And keep in mind, so many of these strategies are going to be helpful for any child who's at any developmental stage. It's not just exclusive to ADHD. Naturally, structures and routines are great for anyone, but especially helpful for the ADHD population. This might look like predictable schedules, checklists, use of timers, programmed reminders. Our phones are great for this. So keeping in mind that we don't necessarily have to remember all of the little things we have to do today if we dictate them into our phones and now we're reminded of those things. Now for younger ages, it might not be phones. Maybe they've got an Apple Watch that is linked to phones and can be used as such. There's other ways to create some of these programmed reminders for them. Externalized organization. This might be visualized planners, calendars, other apps that might be used throughout the home or school. We also want to ensure to use clear and brief instructions. This might mean one, maybe two steps at a time. And this might feel kind of painstaking or inefficient for us who are working with them, but we want it to be effective. We want them to be successful. And it's likely going to mean paring it down to being really clear and quite brief with the instructions or the tasks that we hand out. Positive reinforcement is really important. Specific praise and ideally praise that happens on a daily or even sometimes an hourly rate. We talked about earlier how present focused it can be. So having a reward that only plays out at the end of the week, it will feel so far away for the ADHD brain. Sometimes it might not be on the radar at all. So if it can be a daily process of recognition and reward for the work done, that's going to have a lot greater impact for them. Parent and teacher skills training is a great resource. This is going to be effective for dealing firsthand with the child behavior, but also building skills in us as parents or teachers or what have you on managing our own stress in the moment. Naturally, sleep, exercise, nutrition supports, these are helpful for everyone, But I've seen in my work, and the research supports this too, a really, really helpful link between physical exertion and eventual even exhaustion and ability to regulate, especially in the evenings and through evening routines. Getting that energy out in a physical way is unmatched as far as its treatment benefit for kids and adults. I'll add to that as well. And of course, we want to plan for some of those unsafe situations and risks that could happen. This might be around impulses and misbehavior or breaking rules, especially when it comes to when kids are learning how to drive. We want to be extra aware of those risk-taking impulsive actions that can happen. Um, there's there's obviously so many more current evidence-based strategies that we could talk about or that might be used in classrooms currently. So what I've put up on the screen here is a treatment model that I have to give credit to Russell Barkley, Dr. Russell Barkley, for presenting this at times in the past as well. Now, he's a world leader in ADHD research. He's published so many valuable books and resources for parents, especially in working with ADHD youth. Um, and we want to recognize that these four factors on the corners, medication, accommodation, compassion, and modification, all come back to and are rooted in understanding. And it's encouraging that we're all here to grow our understanding about ADHD in the process of supporting those with ADHD. And that's going to require all four of these quadrants, but some of which we're going to have a lot more direct impact over. So, as we talked about before, ADHD is best viewed as a disorder of self-regulation and executive functioning in terms of understanding how it can be treated. So, several advances in medication, if we're talking about that top left quadrant, have happened over the last few decades. ADHD medication availability and types and different dosages to work up to across the ages is really, really vast, right? And it's a lot for medical doctors to keep up with, but they've done a great job doing so. Um, and while the focus of this presentation isn't on the neuropharmacology of ADHD specifically, it's really interesting for me to hear not too long ago that there is an advance in a neuroprotective effect of long-term use of medication that can, I guess, kind of facilitate brain development and functioning over time. Essentially, that use of medication from for a longer period of time actually reinforces the brain's effectiveness over the course of many years. Again, there may be follow-up questions on that, and this is more just something that I've started to uh, to uh, to read about and understand. So it's just really interesting to see that that can happen. It's also encouraging to hear that given the findings of current evidence-based treatments, it can be concluded that ADHD is among the most treatable psychiatric disorders. And so if we're looking at this treatment model, it's got these four areas in which it can be treated, and we know it can be treated really, really effectively. I'm hoping to explore this model at a closer level and share how I interpret it in some of my day-to-day work and how I apply it to the families that have questions of me or come in for sessions with me. So let's take a brief look at medication. So we know that ADHD meds have a sizable evidence base of research in all of their expansion over the last few decades. This is all happening due to rigorous research and testing. So it's great to see that happening. And we also know that their safety in being used is well established as well. They're relatively convenient to administer to wide ranges of ages. There's oral medication. There's capsules that can be dissolved into food for those kids that don't gravitate towards taking pills. There's also forms of ADHD medication that are done through a skin contact patch that's delayed release. So it's quite convenient to use. there's a high rate of improvement when medication is added to the treatment toolbox. And so between 70 and 90% of clients claim that it does improve their treatment of ADHD. And it's also described that it normalizes in about 50 to 60% of cases, which means that I guess those people who claim that it would normalize their experience, that they don't see a difference in their functioning with the rest of the population as a result of medication being added to their system. Um, on average, ADHD medication is less expensive than some other psychosocial medications, whether that's anxiety, depression, what have you. Again, maybe that's just because of the amount of them that are available. There's also brand name options as generic brands of each of the types of medication, or a lot of them at least. We know that they can be used for years, even into adulthood, and they are really, really effective in community settings. So where there's no caregiver present or there's no adult monitoring the child, the medication is there in the system to give that child a bit of a raised floor um, to present more similar to some of their neurotypical peers. And so this is really helpful in those unsupervised activities. If they're driving or they're alone with friends, you know, riding their bikes or skiing or these types of things. So this also has to do with free time at schools, at recess. The medication might be the only thing that is there is as far as treatment in those settings. So when it comes to accommodation, maybe I'll loosely define what accommodation is first. This is going to be what we can change in the setting for the child, or for us as adults, what we can change in our surroundings to set us up for success. There's various ways that schools already do this for students with IPPs in school to do with their ADHD, that whether that's the use of wobble chairs or permitting them to pace at the back of the room when needed to help with their focus during the day. But essentially, the accommodation has to deal with the ways we alter the environment to benefit the child with ADHD. For example, allowing more time to complete tasks or assignments. This can allow for, well, first it can allow for those frequent distractions that are likely to happen, and the refocusing that would be required just allows more opportunity for that. And it's going to cut down on the distractions for the child themselves. So oftentimes this is taking an exam in a separate room or just being allowed extra time to complete those tasks. When students are seated, this is more to do with preferential or independent seating. When students are seated within the teacher's view, sometimes that can help with a little bit of added urgency to stay focused. Not that the teacher is ordering them to get back to work all the time. It's just having the teacher in their view can help with that urgency to keep refocusing on the work at hand. The more frequent a child with ADHD can be provided with feedback, the more helpful it will be for their success. So, for example, there's some recent use of things like daily report cards in schools where teachers will rate a student in maybe one specific goal or area. Ideally, it's not too much more work for the teacher, but it would be one specific goal, like on-task behavior or the rate of refocusing that they would require that day. The teacher would send that home with the child each day, and then that can be linked with some sort of reinforcement or reward from parents at home. And this has been shown to have quite a bit of improvement in classroom behavior and academic achievement over time. Now, this is just one example, but that's one example of a daily monitoring system that can be used. Most of us have heard of or used the strategy of chunking our work into less daunting and manageable tasks. In my experience, children with ADHD are much more likely to get started on an unpreferred task if the amount of work laying before them doesn't seem insurmountable or impossible. So this can be, directly changed by teachers or even by parents if they're um, supporting them with homework or even household tasks, rather than being told to uh, clean the backyard or tidy their room. It might be start by organizing your laundry, and that's the task. And maybe that's the task for the next little while, and then come back to it and move on to something else. Describing in such large, seemingly insurmountable terms can be really overwhelming, and then no, uh, I guess nothing becomes, or nothing is started in the first place. So compassion in itself, it's it's not necessarily a treatment. That's more of like a an official or maybe even a cold way of describing compassion. But this is much more linked to the relationship with the child themselves. The relationship is going to be foundational for so much of the work that we do, and our genuine compassion for the child is going to be essential for us to have the patience to build that relationship and to value the relationship ourselves as well. So these are just some reminders we want to have at the ready to kind of work through, even just read through on a regular basis before working with our child, before working with our students. These are going to be helpful reminders to unlock and I guess soften us to those feelings of compassion while we work with them. We know that ADHD is brain-based, not behavior-based. Their brains work differently than the neurotypical ones do. And so if we take some of their impulsive behaviors or emotional reactivity in moments, if we take that personally and it's labeled as defiance or disrespect, think of how much more difficult it's going to be to have compassion for that child. I do hear this a lot from parents in initial sessions or intake conversations where they describe my child is so disrespectful when they come home from a day at work or day at school. And they need to know that it's not okay to speak to me that way, or they don't listen. And it's very much a dismissing remark about a child who's struggling with these day-to-day tasks. It just is what it is. It's brain-based, and it's not typically a choice for these children. More often than not, they are, if they could, they would choose to improve their choices along the way. But it's tough and it takes patience. Time management, task management, it is hard. It's hard for all of us. It's especially hard for a brain with ADHD. It's just the reality. And so having more of that patience, whether it's allotting more time for things to be completed or just accepting being late for some things along the way. If there's skill growth happening, then that's what matters most. We want to focus on this child and not most children. This is often something I'll hear from parents or teachers where they'll say, this shouldn't be so difficult. Their sibling handles this really well, or, most kids his age can handle these types of things. And so it's really frustrating that he's still not figuring it out. Right? If we're comparing this child to most children, that's likely not a fair shake, right? That is very limiting as well. And if we continue to do that across the board, where we're comparing their choices to their sibling choices or their choices to the other members of their class, it's just going to hurt our relationship with them, and we're not going to be as patient or as helpful for them along the way. Just see it reading the comment here. Yeah, relationship is huge, and we'll keep coming back to that throughout the rest of the presentation today. And as we've talked about a lot of these strategies, it is not just something we want to apply to those kids with ADHD, right? Relationships important across the board for all of us, for motivation and for feelings of safety and comfort. And we're able to think more clearly if we feel comfortable in that relationship. Moving on to the fourth box there. Emotion regulation, it does need support. A child will eventually calm down over time. That's true. But if we're there to support it and feel patient and comfortable around the negative emotions, that support is going to be essential to them building those skills themselves. Structure and consistency. Those are so important that we oftentimes don't even realize how important. Uh, Clear expectations for kids with ADHD is linked with higher rates of follow through and lower levels of anxiety. Knowing what happens next is great for the ADHD brain. We oftentimes see that more regimented, structured school settings are quite regulating for the ADHD brain. Um, Going into learning environments that are a lot more unstructured and a lot more go with the flow, we may have previously assumed that that would be better for the ADHD brain because there's less pressure placed on it. But with the lack of structure and repetition and clear expectations and knowing what to expect, that can actually be quite dysregulating over time. So a balance of both is important too. Um, we will talk about this more in the next section, but positive reinforcement with all young people, with all people, works for changing behaviors much more than punishment does. In short, if we use punishment, the best we can do, the best we can hope for is eliminating that bad behavior or that negative behavior, the unhelpful behavior. That's the best we can hope for. Unless anyone can correct me on this, the punishing the bad behavior doesn't magically create this surge of positive behavior unless it's out of fear, really, unless it's out of this terrifying fear where we scramble to find something to decrease the punishment. But punishment on its own, the best we can expect is no bad behavior. We're not going to get more good behavior. Positive reinforcement in terms of recognizing and rewarding when the preferred behaviors happens, this is what is linked to future choices to exhibit those behaviors. And I know we've spoken to it quite a bit already. Just a reminder that when you're looking to be compassionate with this population, relationships are foundational to it. We have to focus and build that relationship if we're going to expect them to work with us. Okay. So I recognize that the word modification might read a bit vague. So I've adapted the term to behavior modification. And we're going to spend a bit more time on this fourth area, behavior modification, than we did on the other three, largely because our efforts as adults have a much more direct effect on skill development for kids. Actually, direct and indirect effect on skill development for young people we support, especially when we choose strategies that are proven to work with ADHD. Children will have greater success in the future as a direct result of how we carry out these strategies. So these are going to be the five, I guess, five categories to keep in mind of how we carry out these strategies and how we work with these populations. So what factors flip lids? It's kind of a tongue twister. I shouldn't have done that to myself. But a flipped lid is what will often be described in ADHD literature as a brain where emotion is running the show. There's not a lot of logic to this. It is a dysregulated child. And there is some effective efforts we can do to limit situations that will flip lids of kids. So when possible, we can prepare for these situations a little bit more and recognize that certain situations are going to have much more likelihood of our child becoming dysregulated. So these are going to be settings with little or no structure. Not knowing anything about what's coming up, that can be tough. So even just having a rough guideline of what we're expected to do while we're here. Unclear expectations can lead to eruption sometimes, because when it comes time for us to give it give an order or a request, it will be met with, what? No one told me this was going to be happening, right? I didn't know that this was happening. Like, no one told me. And there's actually some justification to be frustrated there. And it is something when we recognize that we can control. We see this so much when there's a sudden change in expected plans, where it will flip a lid for sure. Where children get these expectations, we're not always sure. but they are so convinced of how this is going to pan out that when it doesn't, it takes a 180-degree turn. It's like the floor falls out from underneath them, and it's a 0 to 100 reaction. Um, so these things are going to happen sometimes unavoidably. So we might have a plan to go to Flying Squirrel, the rec place here in Calgary, and we get there and it happens to be shut down for some reason, right? It happens to be closed and it wasn't on Google. Well, you know what? We couldn't have avoided this. There's not something more we could have done. But sometimes there are, and we want to keep that in mind. This is a big one, that our own volatile emotions to the child that's struggling or having difficulty will sometimes flip their lid. So you see it happen a lot, and maybe it happened to us as kids, where we would be frustrated with something, and then our parent would say, well, if you're going to be upset about it, then now this is the new consequence. Now it's going to be 2 days of grounding rather than one if you're going to take it that way. And that's such a trap for any child with ADHD. But let's say any child. That is such a trap because it it trains us to believe that our emotions are wrong and scary, and then, everything is made to be worse, especially the relationship. So keep that in mind that sometimes our composure can be, well, I should say at all times, our composure is going to be our greatest tool in all of this. Um, Transitions are often described in school and at home as being a challenge for children with ADHD, especially if it's away from a preferred task. If they have to interrupt what they're doing right now that they like and go to something that's a bit more mundane, even if it's just required, that transition, if it's too sudden, unexpected, and it's abrupt, that's going to lead to more flipped lids for sure. Um, Keep in mind though that these transitions are unavoidable, right? They're essential, and they are going to have to happen. So, um, actually going back here for a second, I do recognize that anticipating something or looking for these triggers or avoiding them, it's not actually a feasible strategy in its own right. So otherwise, it's basically saying, oh, what's your strategy for this? Oh, just don't do that, right? That's not a strategy. But if there are some ways now and again where we can increase how we plan towards something or have a few of these things um, in front of our minds, that could be really helpful. But we know that emotional outbursts will happen from time to time, even if we are hyper vigilant to the problem areas where they might occur. Any questions before we go on here? Just to check the chat. All right, we'll keep advancing here. So, as we've mentioned before, ADHD is a disorder of regulation. So, therefore, regulating emotions is going to take a considerable amount of effort, considerably more effort than for neurotypical brains. So, because that regulating of emotions is going to be a struggle, it's important for us to regulate our emotions at the same time and having more patience and ideally more time to let that happen, right? Because, well, I'll often ask the question of adults that work with these kids, um, when you're explaining something to them or going through the logical steps of something while they're dysregulated, how helpful is that? Right? It might be obvious to us because we understand it already. We're just trying to explain it to them. If you just see it the way I see it, then you'll feel better. But convincing them out of that emotional dysregulation it's a hopeless task. But we do want to acknowledge the real and present emotion as it happens. Right, we're getting right into that right now. Yeah, so what can we do in those moments? Well, explaining them out of their emotion is, we might think it's helpful for us because we can expedite this process. At least we think we can, but the emotion that's present is higher priority. So acknowledging that real and present emotion is sometimes all we can do in the moment, rather than, again, convincing a child out of their dysregulated state. For us, if we're frustrated and we're told to just calm down, or everything's fine, there's nothing to be worried about. How do we react to that, right? If that happens to us, we're likely to get pretty defensive and say, hey, that's not even helpful. What do you know, we might react as well. So how much more so is that going to happen for the child too? What I'll often suggest is that whatever energy we would otherwise focus on regulating the child's emotions, we must first focus on energy on regulating ourselves. That analogy of how uh, the tutorial on airplane airplane oxygen masks works, right? You're encouraged to help yourself before assisting others. We're only going to be as effective in supporting them as we are regulated ourselves. We also want to mirror what helpful emotions, or sorry, what helpful emotional coping looks like in that moment. Um, if the child is losing it, and they see that now we are losing it in response to them losing it, now we're both out of control, and that is scarier than the previous situation. I'll often describe this as hopping into the boat with the child in these moments. So they're panicked because they're overwhelmed and it's like they're sinking in a little life raft in 2 feet of water. And that's scary for them because they don't necessarily see that. They don't understand that they're in a state of panic. When we react to their reactions, it's like we jump into that boat with them and now we're both scared. Now, in a way, it's enticing to pull someone into that boat with us because then at least we're not struggling by ourselves. But eventually, if that child looks out and sees that there's an adult standing in that water or on the shore who is calm, they'll come around to see, okay, that is comfortable. And they'll start to look around the surroundings and realize maybe that the circumstances I'm worried about aren't real. And because we know that logic isn't going to be helpful in that dysregulated state, we might want to take a note of what we would have said in that moment. And once the emotion has run its course or the reaction has run its course, we can talk about it later on and bring it up in a more objective and curious sense. We're likely to have a lot more utility with that afterward rather than during. Now, reminders. I'm often asked by parents, when will my child no longer need all these reminders, right? When's that going to be? I'm sick and tired. I shouldn't have to give them all of these reminders. When will I not have to give them? Or when won't they need them anymore? Well, the short answer is never. I know that might not be an answer we like to hear, but we're always going to need reminders. All of us are going to need reminders. Over time, that as a child matures and builds their skills, they'll learn to take on the process of reminders through maybe lists themselves or cell phone alerts, timers, developmental patterns, what have you. But at this stage, reminders are a part of life. So knowing that reminders are essential, they're going to be here. We're not going to get out of giving reminders. We want to consider how many reminders we feel like we have to give, and how many of those reminders that we think we are giving, we aren't, right? If we walk by a child's room and just say, we're leaving in 5 minutes, okay, yeah, we might think in our mind, great, I've reminded them that happened. It didn't happen. So then we walk by again, leaving in 2 minutes, yep, got it. And we walk back and give more and more of these reminders. We likely haven't given even one reminder as far as the child is concerned. And now we're angry and now we're frustrated. And so then we think to ourselves that, oh, well, I can only get buy-in or follow through once I yell, right? Why do I have to, or why doesn't my child, respond until I'm yelling, right? Because maybe that's the first reminder-esque thing that they register. So instead, we can be working smarter, not harder with our reminders. And it might be a little extra effort, but we want to give a complete reminder as opposed to one of these half or fake reminders that we might be used to giving currently. Um, because in the previous example, after we've finally screamed a reminder, we think that that's required to get follow through. Um, but instead, we want to work on this complete reminder. So what does that mean? Complete reminder. I've mentioned Russell Barkley before, but his advice is going to be involving as many of the child's five senses as we can in that reminder. So what this can look like is we get down on their level, maybe even in between them and what they're doing. Now, this might bother them at first if we stand between them and the TV, but that visual bothering that we see is evidence that this reminder is likely happening. Might just be getting down their level, put a hand on their shoulder, or even two hands on both shoulders, lower the tone of our voice. Because if they're used to yelling, then this might be what is required so it stands out from the yelling. Um, and we want to anticipate that this will interrupt the situation for them. But reminders that, reminders will be a little bit frustrating if they're heard. So that might be even a litmus test for whether or not the reminder landed. If the child is irritated, visibly irritated by the reminder, then maybe that reminder is much more likely to have occurred. Any questions about this conversation around or this exploration of reminders themselves? We'll come back to them at the end if there are. All in all, in how we use our reminders, we want to work smarter and not harder, because otherwise we've really worked ourselves up to the point that we're angry because of something we've taken personally. And the child has no causal effect on that. We are just angry now. And if we're not composed, we're not going to be as effective of supports. So I want to work through or look closely at how we give positive feedback and how we carry out reinforcement. One thing we want to eliminate is tiptoeing around a child. If we're used to seeing them get frustrated or used to seeing them struggle, we might alter how we would talk to them or sort of ask everything as a question. Hey, do you want to start getting ready for this next thing? Hey, do you want to start putting that away so we can start this? That's kind of tentative, and in the long run, it can evoke a sense of low confidence in them. It's almost comes across like, hey, I don't think you can do this, so I'm just bringing it up because I'm kind of doubting you anyway. I know that's not our intention, but it can come across that way. So they do pick up on this tiptoeing, just like we would pick up on it if other people are tiptoeing around us. And again, it's likely just to increase the overall anxiety of the interaction. We talked about earlier how awareness is impacted by ADHD. So sometimes it means we narrate what it is that they are doing. Now, this one can feel a little confusing at first. This might be a rushed explanation of it, but when the child does something or the youth makes a choice that seems unexpected or that kind of catches us off guard, rather than saying, hey, put that back, or hey, go to your, leave the room after you've said something like that, right? Rather than correcting it or consequencing it right away, we merely observe it out loud. I might just say, you got really angry there and threw the remote across the room, and now the battery is rolled onto the fridge. Maybe that might be too much information to talk about, but just tell them what it is that they are doing or what they just said. And then we wait 5 or more seconds. Maybe we repeat it because they're looking at us like they're confused what's happening right now. And we repeat what they just did. You just got angry and threw that across the room. Now, at times, right, this might help the child be directed towards connecting the dots and effectively undoing what they just did or taking some action. And this is going to be much more effective if we keep our emotional opinion out of it. So emotional opinion is going to be that if we're judgmental about it or we're saying, hey, you just got angry and threw that across the room, that's going to feel like it's the same as correcting or scolding. But if we're curious about it and just narrating it like we're David Attenborough, right? Oh, you just threw that across the room. Oh, I could see you got angry there, and then you tossed that over there, or you push your sister off the couch. What this does is it creates a space for the child to become aware of what they do, of what they've done, and correct it. And then they get a chance to, in a sense, almost get away with it in their mind. Because if we see them become aware of it, correct it, then we can make the commitment of saying, we're going to move on, forget it ever happened. Because what's more important here is the practice of becoming aware of the choice and making an alternate choice. That's much more important than understanding that it's wrong, that you shouldn't do this. More often than not, a child knows the rules. They know what's expected of them, but their awareness isn't caught up to their impulsive choices. So those bits of knowledge they have don't, or they're not available at that moment. So yeah, question across here. So this question says, I hope that by asking the question, could you would help get a commitment, but is it better to directly state that they do the request? That's a good question. Um, I would say that sometimes we are asking that as a general question because we want their opinion on something. Hey, how do you feel about going here for dinner tonight? Or how do you feel about helping me with preparing this? Do you want to do that? Sometimes it is, do you want to? Because if you want to, you can. Otherwise, you don't have to. But if it's a general thing in terms of this is next on the agenda, asking it of them can be a little confusing because it gives the opportunity to say, well, no, I don't want to do that. And so we sometimes entrap ourselves by asking it as a question. So if it's a generally a question, by all means, we're going to ask them. But we get in the habit of asking everything as a question, and we'll know if it's because we're tiptoeing or if it's because we genuinely want to know what their opinion is. When it comes to applying positive reinforcement, we want to focus again on something that can be earned daily in an ideal world because it's more present focused. It's within our control right now. It's going to be on their radar much more than, hey, remember, if you keep on the straight and narrow here, you'll earn this thing at the end of the month. That's too far in advance. We're not going to be thinking about it in the moment. But if it's a daily reward, this gives them the chance to earn the reward or not earn the reward on a given day, which can motivate tomorrow's choices regardless of the outcome. If we follow through with consistency and this was the expectation, they didn't follow through with it, we're okay with that. Just means you didn't earn that today. But remember, tomorrow is your next chance to make that happen. Oftentimes we'll see tomorrow a higher level of motivation because we know that, oh, I could have and I didn't. So tomorrow I'm really, really going to put my best foot forward on this. So following through with either side of that is really important. And as stated before, we want to leave our emotional reaction out of it. We might really be rooting for them to earn this thing today, but we want to let the earned reward do the heavy lifting. So done if they've done the work to earn it, great. Here you go. You've earned it for your day. Here's your video game time, or here's your, whatever the reward might be. But if they haven't earned it, we don't want to respond with anger or disappointment that they didn't earn it, because then it becomes more about our reaction as opposed to the reinforcer itself. So we want to be able to commit to feeling okay with either outcome. Oh, you earned it today. Cool. Or you didn't. Well, I know you were wanting that. Tomorrow's the next chance to earn it. We leave our emotional reaction out of it the best we can. As we talked about, this system of consequences is where we want to put our trust. We want to let it do the heavy lifting so we don't have to be the bad cops all the time. Because none of us like to be the bad cops. We don't like to, but sometimes we feel like that's where we are stuck. Why do I always have to be the bad cop here? It's probably because we're signing up for that role regularly. So if we can remodel the system where the consequences or the earned reward is what is providing that urgency, then we're going to be much better off, and we can, definitely work more on the relationship throughout all of it. The next, the next quadrant here is facilitating natural consequences. So we're often motivated to prevent our child from making mistakes naturally, right? And of course, this is ingrained in our minds when it comes to making mistakes that are life and death mistakes. Of course, we don't want them to make those. We'll prevent those. And then our safe versus unsafe mistakes, we're going to step in and try and prevent those too. Um, but it might also lead to any type of mistake. We really don't want them to make a mistake that is going to be uncomfortable for them, or that maybe they might face some embarrassment or judgment for. So naturally, we're going to be motivated to prevent these mistakes, but we know that personal experience is ideal for learning. And as with so many of these concepts, it's the case for any child, case for any young person, but especially with ADHD. Right? Learned experience is huge for learning. It's much more efficient. So the memory of that necessary discomfort after making a mistake for that individual, that's what might provide the urgency to avoid that same mistake in the future. And it might take a number of times, but rather than our focus be on preventing them making the mistake, where possible or where we're okay with the mistake being made, we provide the space for that natural consequence to play out. Right? So if it's something's due tomorrow and I haven't started it and it's past my bedtime, we might be enticed to step in and help them grind it out and have something to hand in tomorrow. But that's just affected or that's alleviated the current discomfort, but then that natural consequence didn't provide any learning. So if we can step back and allow that to play out, say like, yeah, it's going to be pretty tough tomorrow, but we'll see how it goes, right? Or even just be hands off in that moment because we're okay with our child going to school without something to hand in, right? That will be an uncomfortable process for them, but if we can handle it and we're sure that they can handle it too, it might be uncomfortable, but that we can sit back and see what type of urgency that can create for them to follow through the next time. Um, as mentioned, urgency is what often leads an ADHD brain to take action. Um, this is why we oftentimes see a lot of procrastination patterns with ADHD, especially in students. But for any of us where there's tasks to be done, they get put off. We wonder why that is the case. Um, Often it has to do with that present focus of the mind. If something is 2 days from now, it's not on our radar. We can deal with the now and do what we're doing until that's all of a sudden right in front of us. And now there's panic. And we see a lot of actually quite efficient work happen in this state of urgency. So we know that the urgency is a helpful motivator to take action. So what could we do then as supporters to facilitate urgency? And we can be as creative as we need to be with facilitating urgency because it works really well for these brains. Um, but when, sorry, going on here, the discomfort that the child experiences the last time they were in the situation can provide a bit of a flashbulb memory for them in that moment, and that urgency required to avoid that mistake next time. Um, it may take multiple attempts, and it's really, really tough for us as parents. Oftentimes, it's harder for us to sit back and let them make that mistake than it would be for us to do all the effort to ensure they avoid it. But keep in mind that may be for our discomfort more than theirs. You see that young people are quite resilient when it comes to something that's tough. They move on from it pretty quickly. Oftentimes, it's going to be much more quickly than we would move on from that image of them being uncomfortable in that mistake that they made. But our focus is going to be on their future development and prioritizing that over the present moment. I want to back up there and see if I can. Does it sometimes happen that a child doesn't learn from the consequences because they can't or don't have the skills to do so? That's a great question. And that can definitely happen where the child doesn't learn and they keep making that mistake. And oftentimes that might be because it is directly in their area of skill deficit, right? So if a child has never proved that they can get somewhere on time on their own, we're unlikely to let that play out as the primary way of learning, right? But if they've demonstrated that this is something they can do, and we as parents evaluate the situation, or we as teachers evaluate the situation and say, I'm 100% sure the child can handle this, then handle this being the discomfort of making the mistake, then that's where letting those natural consequences play out can be effective for the child's learning. So I would definitely trust your better judgment in terms of, is this something where we can sit back and let the natural consequences play out? Or is this just going to be uh, piling on for the child because it's not been demonstrated something they can do, or they haven't demonstrated they can do it in any sense yet? So I wanted to move on to just another reminder here. We've progressed out of that treatment model now, and these are just some reminders to consider our own well-being again, because we hear it all the time. Take care of yourself. There's all these self-care initiatives everywhere we look, and then we're talking about it, but they're still often overlooked. And if we're not taking care of, if we're not considering our own needs, our own emotional well-being, we're not going to be effective supporters for the kids who need it most. So whether this is meeting with other adults with shared experiences, taking part in workshops such as this or other ones, um, it can be great reminders to take care of ourselves and uh, to ensure that we are at our best, or at least close to that, if we're going to be helping others. So if this is channeling more of our energy into our own self-regulation, like we talked about before putting all this effort into calming the child down or into changing the situation for them, take a moment and put some of that energy into our own composure so that we can make better decisions and be more confident in them as we're helping them. That's going to go a long way. Also, we want to consider individual therapy along the way, ADHD skills coaching for the young people, and maybe it's individual or parenting focused counseling with someone like myself or someone else. Here at the Family Psychology Place, we offer a range of supports for parents in these situations, as well as the child themselves. Sometimes I'll meet with only parents on carrying out these ADHD strategies in the home and out in public. And I don't even work individually with the child. It's merely just coaching the parents and talking through their specific examples and specific day-to-day routines and seeing what strategies will, or recommending which strategies work best with that child. So putting in that time and effort and sometimes resources into ensuring that we are as well-oiled machines as we can be. We hear it all the time, but actually applying it is easier said than done. So we want to make sure we do that. So just a few takeaways now and again, these are reminders to ourselves that ADHD brains are unique. They're not faulty. There's not something wrong with this child. There's just something different. And it is not a deficit in intelligence or ability or anything along those lines. It's a deficit in regulation. It's a deficit in certain aspects that maybe our brains don't have that, but it is not faulty. There's not something wrong. It's not something they need to fix or change to fit into society. We can work with it, and these are really, really bright, capable people that we're working with. We also want to remember that emotion regulation is hard work. It's hard work for any of us, but especially for this group. We can help them through reducing conflict, and sometimes that's going to be a great place to start. Recognize, I want to be able to better support this child, but everything turns into a fight. So maybe I won't even bother. Well, maybe we focus more on becoming more of a safe, comfortable space to address this child. And then we can start to gravitate towards these other applications or strategies. We picturing that model in place, right? Our understanding is paramount to all of this. So the more that we understand, we learn it, but then we have to remember it and repeat it to ourselves so that we can feel that compassion in the moment. Because naturally, we're going to fall into that habit of getting frustrated because, oh, why is this such a struggle? Like, I would have never had this issue, or their sibling doesn't deal with this, or most kids can handle this already. Why am I still, so frustrated, or why is this still so frustratingly difficult for him or her? We also want to remind ourselves of that encouraging reality that ADHD is among the most treatable disorders when we consider all those factors of what we can do to help modify and support there with the addition of medication, with our compassion along the way, and any accommodations that we can apply to the environments, be it home or school. We know that ADHD is successfully treatable in so many cases. And all in all, we don't want to forget our own emotional regulation. We talked about what accommodations we can make to the physical environment. Don't forget that our relationship with each of these children is their environment. We as parents, we as coaches or teachers, or just adults that help along the way, we are a big part of their environment. So even though we're not a wobble stool, or we're not headphones or things like that, we are their environment. And so our work does not go unnoticed. One of them is more Alberta focused, being the CADRA website. CADAC is the Canadian website for ADHD awareness, education, training. And there's a lot of training opportunities and webinars and parent information on these websites that are conducted virtually, sometimes in person, and they'll direct you through those ways. I've included another resource here as well as just looking into some of the local psychology or counseling services. There's likely going to be more presentations like this that we at the family psychology place put on, and we will advertise those to the communities. And so there is more and more availability of presentations such as this one that parents can take part in. As far as meeting with other parents with those experiences, sometimes it ends up being open conversation about it, whether it's talking with the other hockey parents and bringing up ADHD. Thankfully, it's becoming less and less of a stigmatized term. We're so readily aware of it that it's not something that raises eyebrows if someone talks about an ADHD diagnosis or a new diagnosis. A great process too is if we're wondering whether our child fits this diagnosis or whether they would be diagnosed with it, uh, we can look into getting a full psychoeducational assessment for these children, because it will give us so much insight and information into what else might be contributing to their struggles at home or at school or with relationships. And those are available through offices like ours at Family Psychology Place, as well as others. And it can be a really, really great process. And an outcome of that process, or an output of that process, is going to be recommendations for what to do next, what resources to access, what specific um, um, action items would be most beneficial. Okay, so just advancing here to uh, our last slide. Our website is listed there for anyone as well as it is in the chat. Feel free to just take a look around our website at any time. Familiarize yourself with the services we offer. My primary focus at the Family Psychology Place is in the counseling and the behavioral skills coaching side of things. We do have clinicians who specialize in assessment as well as counseling, and so we have a, a vast team that all work together and collaborate the best that we can. And so we're available in a variety of ways, and I would just encourage anyone to check out our website if you get the chance. So I know we're reaching our time here. I appreciate everyone for participating today and joining in. Thanks for providing this opportunity. It's been enjoyable for me. It's a great mix-up or a great shake-up in my usual day-to-day, so appreciate that. What I might do is just hand it back to Lindsay to share any closing remarks if need be. Thank you so much,
Sure.
everyone.